Hello and welcome to our program. Please welcome on our show today Professor Balram Singh, who's the founding director of the Department of Indic Studies, University of Massachusetts. Professor Balram Singh, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much. It's my great pleasure to be here.
Wonderful to have you here, and also to learn from you that you are a chemist by training, by passion, and so deeply interested in Indic studies.
I was at the University of Massachusetts professor of chemistry, and in 1997, when India was celebrating its 50th Independence Day, all throughout the world, I think everybody was supposed to do the flag hoisting and the national anthem at the same time. And I was in my campus. I was a young professor at that time, a young assistant professor, and I found that this thing was, the program was organized in a very hush-hush way.
Okay.
Because in the US we didn't have too many people, and most of people did privately these things. So there was a professor, Professor Madhu Jhaveri, who did he was a civil engineer, engineering professor, and so he did in his lab. And then there were some sweets distributed, and I was a little bit taken aback with that. I said, well, India is a great country, it's a big democracy, we should celebrate it openly. And in the process I found out that actually there was no way other than a student doing this on campus to set up a venue and do the program. The faculty, I was a professor of chemistry, so
right.
I couldn't book a urban room because this was not a chemistry related thing, and we had conversations with few other faculty after that. And we thought that we should have something by the faculty, and because as a faculty we couldn't have association, we had just belonged to a department. And so we thought about how do we do, and some of my senior colleagues thought that if we had a center, actually ours was a center for Indic studies, if we could set up a center, maybe then we can be associated with that, and that's how the journey started. And I was just known to be a research faculty on campus, so I had a little bit access to the administration, and so I pursued this.
And the center was set up.
And the center was eventually set up.
Okay.
And since I pursued this, they thought that I will be the director. So I was not even consulted, believe it or not. When the center was approved eventually after a couple of years, it was also announced that I will be the director. And that's how my journey of the Indic studies from chemistry started.
Do you feel, Professor, that Indic studies have influenced Western thought?
Indic studies as a system that we have developed, I think it has made some difference, but Indian ideas over long period of time, even you can go to Greeks, and the Greeks were, the Greek philosophy, which is the Western world today, cites in many places, although they don't believe in all of this.
Right.
But they do cite their background. But the Greeks were very influenced, and they also influenced Indian thoughts, as were the Egyptians and Chinese. And in all kind of aspects, philosophical, scientific, medical, technology, all these things were quite interchanged a long time ago. And then of course in more modern times, whether you look at even the Christianity is very well thought of by the scholars, is being influenced by Buddhism, quite a bit of it. Okay. So even that process is affected. And then in more modern times, scientific ideas, many of the scientific ideas, many of the concepts that is so much humanitarian, and now of course yoga and Ayurveda, they're all influencing the Western world, and they're changing them, maybe slowly, and right. But they're definitely.
You talk of Schrodinger also being impacted.
Erwin Schrodinger, who got Nobel Prize for his Schrodinger wave equation to explain quantum mechanics, and he was very well. First of all, he was a student of Schopenhauer, who was a philosopher in German philosopher, and he learned about Upanishads, and he learned about Vedas and Vedantas, and he cites, he knows in his own writing, he has written a book called What is Life, and he went around in whole Europe giving lectures on science, but more philosophical aspect of it, and inspire scientists to get involved. Mostly he was a physicist. He also tried to inspire physicists to get into more biological system. And in the process, he has written that he was very much affected by Upanishads, many of the teachings of Upanishads. I have read a biography of his where it is clearly mentioned that he got the idea of electrons location or probability of finding electrons, it is difficult to get the location, was from the concept of Maya, because it appears and disappears. Until then, and many times, believe it or not, even if you can go to chemistry department, and many chemistry professors even would you find that they still think that electron goes around the nucleus. That is not what happens, and it was the contribution of Schrodinger, and he got this idea, at least he it's accepted in his biography that he got this idea from the concept of Maya, which appears and disappears. So nobody knows where the electron is and when, and that is a great mystery, and people have gotten Nobel Prize to just tell that. But he got this idea that it is appearance and disappearance. The only thing you can do is calculate the probability of finding something in some place. And so he was a mathematician. He had a lot of mathematical background. He came up with the equation called Schrodinger wave equation.
Right. So science and spirituality, do they meet? Do they become one? Do they enrich each other? Do they walk hand in hand? What's the relationship?
Science is a very rational something that I can share with you, and you will also have same feelings or same acceptance. What this is, if I do experiment, it will be acceptable only if you can also do the same experiment. I get the observation, I make the observation, you also should make the observation. I get the same data, you also get the same data. So many times people, the spiritual thing is so personal, and unless you are, I and you are at the same level somewhere, and I am making it up, some of it, and some of it is I have some experience, because I did end up learning a yoga which I did not know before much. In 1999, and started practicing, and then started seeing the difference. And I'm observant. I'm a empirical scientist. I do the experiments, and so I did experiments with my thoughts and thinking about it. And I have this clue that to make the spirituality science, we have to elevate ourselves. But right now we only deal with material world, which is much easier to deal with in terms of what you do, what I do, or maybe third or fourth person does, it has to be the same. But slowly the world is moving towards it, where you can, as you can see, that people now studying what used to be psychology, and we as a chemist would not even accept it, any of the psychological hypotheses or even philosophical things. And I am one example who actually, believe it or not, I taught a course for 14 years at the university called Chemistry of the Mind, and since 2000 I started teaching that course to graduate students, and it was very popular course.
Okay.
Mind is not something that people accept. It will be more close to spirituality, but it can be examined through science, and I think it's just a question of elevating ourselves, and there is a neuroscience now actually supporting this kind of ideas.
When we talk of Vedic tradition, what really is Vedic tradition? It's a nice, very Indian sounding word, and does it have a place in the modern day world today?
Well, the Vedic has several meanings to
Okay.
several people. Some
Right.
people take it very historical, and they think it was 5,000 years ago or 50,000 years ago. Some people say millions years ago. So they, whatever the time frame is, the people just take a very, very historical. Then some people think there are some ideas which were Vedic in origin. And Vedic Veda, of course, as you know, I'm sure you know, and most of the audience knows, that it means knowledge. By the way, science also means knowledge. So it's just it comes from Latin word, which
Okay.
means knowledge. So it's just knowledge. Many people take the knowledge from Vedas, and some of them they think that's fixed. That knowledge, many people believe that there is in the Vedas that whatever is written is really fixed. It's deep, as known as pramana or the proof.
Okay.
And you don't need to go out anywhere else, and you do not need to question, but it has been Indian tradition to question anything and everything. Many of the Vedas, Vedic knowledge like Upanishads, where the question answer, just like you and I having, or Bhagavad Gita, which is considered part of Vedanta, also is a question answer. So
True.
it is in many ways it's just knowledge system, and the third level is that whatever it has evolved into, and that has influence of circumstances. Some people have maintained the practice of it, because science like I said, I'm an empirical scientist, and I think if I cannot do it myself, I cannot prove it by my own my own experiments, then it's very difficult for me to accept. The same thing should apply to the Vedic thought. To those of us who want to promote it or advance it, then we should be aware of it, what it is, and we should be able to experience. And I think that's how it will go forward. But then there are many claims and counterclaims about Vedas, and it becomes part of religion, which is different than what Vedas are. I mean, there is knowledge there for everybody. It's not one particular religious group or the other. People may agree or disagree. So then it becomes an issue. In terms of science, I believe that I consider the Vedas being created by people who were a very high level of scientists. And the definition of scientist is simply that I should not be attached to whatever the observations are. I should be unbiased.
Okay.
And I mean, I'm a professor, so I'm still called a professor. I have books, and I will tell people, I put my name on the books and the papers. But many of the people who have said some things or created something, they didn't even put their names because they were so detached.
True.
And so my first line is that I will believe what is written in Vedas, but I will try to prove it. If it is not provable, then obviously I cannot accept it. But my first line is not to say, oh, this is all nonsense, because my first thing is that those people, in most cases that I have come across, are the people who were completely detached and they were not biased, and they said it for the benefit of the society. They didn't put a copyright, they didn't put a patent, they didn't put their name on anything. And that's, I think, a very high level of science than what I do today, or my scientist colleagues do.
There's also saying says if you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything.
Sure.
So how do you manage the detachment yet having convictions and knowing that my convictions are going to change? They're not etched and cast in stone. I need to stand for something. I need to have something to peg my belief, my reason, my rationality on.
Sure.
Or is growth beyond reason, rationality, truth as we see it now?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think science has been accepted today for the precise reason that they are willing to accept that they are wrong, if somebody can point it out. And we have agreed upon principles, and we do that. So when you are looking at when you have to stand up, I mean, we normally have hypotheses. Sometimes they are based on some observations, sometimes they are based on some problems. If there is a problem, you getting sick, we all getting sick, I will have to come up with some hypothesis, either maybe some bacteria or virus or dust or something like that, and then I have to look for it. So I stand on my hypothesis until I get the proof. If I don't get the proof, I change my hypothesis and move on. The problem is that those people who hang on to their hypothesis and that's the only thing they want to prove, and if anything else shows up, they don't want to look at it, and that becomes a problem. So you can stand up on something, but you're clinging on to something, and that's not what scientists generally do. And I think that's why the science becomes more acceptable to the society, because I'm willing to be wrong if you just tell me, and we can agree then on basic format and standards and framework, and then if you according to the same framework, and if you told me that this is not true, then I have to accept to advance even the science. So the basic idea is that one has to think that we are doing this, number one, to find the truth, second is to serve the society.
Right.
Not for me, not my name, not my fame, not my next generation, or my even country. A scientist eventually, I mean, as a scientist, we trust all the scientists from wherever.
Right.
Because this is a great advance because of that. We have great advancement in science, because it doesn't matter whether Russian scientist, Chinese, Malaysian, Indian or Nepalese or whatever, somebody, because we have agreed to this framework, and
right.
If you do something you found, I can also do and find. If I find that yours is not true, I'll let you know.
Right.
And it's acceptable that you will accept that.
So that's its organic and it's independent yet interdependent nature.
Yes,
and I
very
think that's
true.
the balance. Wonderful. We're going to go in for a short break, Professor Balram Singh. When we come back, we'll want to learn from you. You're doing science and technology in Sanskrit. You're a visiting professor right now at JNU, and
Yes.
this is the course that you're teaching. You're also very, very closely involved with the chemistry of Ayurveda.
Yes.
And you have a deeper understanding because of your background. Right. So we'll talk about all that and a lot more, but after this short break, stay with us.
बच्चे आजकल खेलना ही भूल गए हैं। जब देखो वीडियो गेम्स। रियल गेम खेलें? So beautiful. Yeah. कॉलेज प्लेयर होगी। मम्मी।
हल्दी और चंदन के गुण समाए संतूर, त्वचा कुछ और निखारे। My mummy star player.
Welcome back. We're still in conversation with Professor Balram Singh, who has a deep interest in Indic studies, and of course, chemistry is his passion. Professor Balram, chemistry and Ayurveda, how are you using your expertise in one to understand the other?
I got exposed to all this because of being director of Center for Indic Studies at University of Massachusetts. There are a lot of concerns about Ayurveda outside.
Okay.
And many times I get calls from people because, like I was saying earlier, we created a niche for the center, and then we became known for it in the United States, and we will get calls from people. We were well known. I mean, the Center for Indic Studies at UMass Dartmouth is very well known, and people will call us. What do you think of this? There was a report that all the Ayurvedic medicines are they're poisons and this
steroids and things like that.
Yes. Well, the steroids more of metals. I think they
Okay.
were concerned about metals.
The
There were
metallic
several
residue.
metallic residue. There were several reports, and some of them are really true. They're bad quality, but there is a system, and I looked into it. So I started looking at, being chemist, obviously that's my area that I should
Which is what we
understand.
call the bhasam.
Bhasma.
Okay, bhasma.
Yeah,
okay.
they call it bhasma. And so I looked there, and I found that there are heavy metals which are very high in content. They are considered toxic by chemists and pharmacists. So I wanted to explore more, because I found that there is a whole system of bhasma in Ayurveda, and this is all heavy metals. So how the same thing is being used as a medicine for so long time, and apparently nobody was dying or having toxicity.
Right.
And I was very interested. In the meantime, we got a grant from a foundation who were interested in looking for science and technology in ancient Indian texts. That was the topic. And the foundation, the person who was holding the foundation is a technology person, and he said that because he said, I'm coming to you because you're a scientist, and I don't want to go to somebody else because I know that they will talk about all kind of things, but I really want to do something. You want to look for something that we can test it. Whatever you find, we want to test it.
Okay.
And that was an opportunity. We look for a lot of things, and it is not easy to find in this country the texts, manuscripts, inaccessible. I'm sure people in this country know that getting anywhere, there is a bureaucracy, is very, very difficult. So we settled on some Ayurvedic texts which are easier to find, and we translated with the help of Professor Girish Nath Jha at the Special Center of Sanskrit Studies in JNU. He was my collaborator, and we had some funding together, and we found this, and it happened to be, the book is called Rasayan Sar, and it's the whole thing about bhasma. And I'm being chemist, I didn't really read it myself. When I got the English translation of it, I then looked at it. It's very, very deeply chemistry type of process. There are 42 steps, very clearly written 42 steps how to do it. Of course, they starts with putting the metal in Gomutra, then most of the scientists probably will leave at that point and say,
Right.
go somewhere else. And the next step is put in Gobar, and then most people that leave that one, this is.
So they'll go by the exterior, this thing, but not by the chemical. This
Yeah,
thing.
so I recruited some, in chemistry department, I recruited about half a dozen of my colleagues, and
Okay.
including inorganic chemists, and then we started looking at it very seriously, because of I'm myself a professor, I'm a chemistry professor, so it has a label of acceptability to my colleagues, but if I'm taking it seriously, there must be something serious.
Right.
And we looked at it, and we are working on this. On that particular aspect, and in the literature we found, it's not our discovery, we found that actually bhasms are what is known as today as nanoparticles. So in this whole process, what people used to think, they translate in English as ash. There is really no translation of bhasm in English, because bhasm is a very I think they call it Sodhan Kriya in Hindi.
Okay.
So they use treated, it's a kind of a
Purification.
yeah, purification, they call it purification, not exactly purification also.
Okay.
It is a processed material, let's say, you know, in the absence of any other word, we can just call it a processed material. But bhasm is a bhasm. A lot of people have done on gold nanoparticles or gold bhasm, and we started doing on silver.
Okay.
And we have found a lot of very interesting things out of it, and in addition to being nanoparticles which has its own values, and we are looking into some of this, and some of this will be patented. We are
Okay.
some of the processes I mean, we cannot patent the bhasm, but we can patent the application of bhasm in certain areas. But we found that actually it's, in addition to nanoparticles, they also there is a lot of, I just only told about gomutra and gobar, but they have herbs, a lot of herbs, and the heating and beating and mechanical, so it's like a huge process.
Okay.
So I think that which we are still trying to discover, what is really surrounding the nanomaterial is still a mystery. We have found some. We have about, in our research, we have found about 70% what is in this material. We don't know the 30%, and we have done every possible technology that you can imagine in chemistry that is available right now, and we haven't found it. So in addition to the fact that we want to find out what else is in there, we know it's not toxic. We have done, my lab does cell cultures, and we have done on cells, and cells are surviving just fine. And I think there is something that is coming from the herbal chemistry which surrounds this, which makes it non-toxic, and that may have even medicinal value.
So, Professor, are we sitting at a very critical juncture where, unless and until we understand how critical it is for us to see knowledge not as an individual effort but as a contribution to a collective source for evolution?
Very true. I think we are sitting at the cusp for a variety of reasons. One of them is technological. And particularly Indian society has, for whatever reason, has bought this idea that they need to be westernized and they need to get the same level of comfort, and but they are not even, you know, the thing is that the Western world has gone through a process, and so they understand the system much better. Even there are something that we see from outside, but they know the inside, just like Indian society knows about Indian.
Right.
So many times we are copying things without understanding the process that they have gone through. It's to give an example, if we need 37 grams of protein every day. That's the standard by science. But if we didn't eat it, how about we injected it? 37 grams, because we know that we need 37 grams. Actually, there will be allergy. If we injected 37 grams of protein in our body in the morning, so that we don't have to cook, we don't have to clean, nothing, because we know that's how we need. Science tells you to do that. You will have allergy, and you probably will not survive the day. The similar idea is that if you get the ideas or comforts from outside without going through the process, then you do not know, and you probably will have allergy, equivalent to allergy. And of course, in addition to the fact that we are copying and we are not knowing, we are becoming very comfortable and maybe even slave of some kind, that many of the ideas that are Indian, which many Western societies have gotten and or they are getting, it will not be advanced. And so we will develop a society of very complex. They will have inferiority complex.
Right.
Your young people will have inferiority complex, because they will always have to think that they never had anything of their own.
Yeah.
Just like, I mean, I grew up in a village, and I have a lot more confidence because I grew up in a village, even though maybe at one time I wasn't thinking that was the best thing for me to happen. But the fact that I did go through the process, it helps me now today to be very strong, because I know that from the bottom of the society to the top of the society, I have seen it all, and I go back and forth.
You spoke of Mother Earth. The mother of all languages, we say Sanskrit, is the root where a lot of languages have evolved from. Science and technology in Sanskrit, which is what you're doing,
Yes.
the study of science. Tell us a bit about this.
So I mean, Sanskrit, I'm just very fascinated. I studied mostly science in my life, but I find the language itself to be a science.
Okay.
There is no other language like this, and it's the way it has been organized. It's very natural. You know, you start with all the swaras, or the vowels, which is start with ah, which is really you don't touch anything, nothing touches it. Ah, e, u, is all the air coming from your chest, and then you start with ka, the ka, kha, ga, gha, and then you start with cha here, cha, cha, ja, jha, and then you go to ta, which is the tongue touches the palate, and then you have ta, which is touches your teeth, and then eventually the lips, pa, pha, ba, bha, ma. So it is very organized, and I'm very interested in this because I also am interested in neuroscience. My other area of research is neurotoxin, and so I have a little bit of experience in that, and I was also teaching this course on chemistry of the mind. Is the how you speak, and there is a lot of biomechanical research being done these days in the Western world, actually in modern science, of how the air passes through your oral cavity and where it touches.
So that's why chanting is therapeutic.
It may have, I mean, nobody has done this kind of research. People have seen the effect of it, but they haven't done exactly mechanism. But the mechanism could be that the way you speak and the way you pronounce things and the way the air passes through your oral cavity, which is quite heavily innervated by the cranial nerves, and that may be touching those, and they have activate certain areas of your brain. It is well established now. Actually, there is a scientific paper published on people doing fMRIs and reading Sanskrit versus, well, they actually read Devanagari, which was just Hindi, and they read English, and they read Chinese and Russian, and they found that Sanskrit is the one which lights up the whole brain.
Wow.
Versus English, which largely activates the left brain. Very analytical, mathematical thing, but the Sanskrit is something that does. Chinese also does more, but the Sanskrit does the most. So the language itself is scientific to get you the answer, and I am very fascinated with that. But also we are very interested in the knowledge that is in Sanskrit, and I am focusing more on Ayurveda and yoga. But we are also interested in other technologies, particularly metallurgy, because we think that Ayurveda, this bhasma that I was talking, couldn't be too different from other technology that were available. Like, I mean, in today's world, we have nanomaterials, so we have nanomedicine. We have so many things that we learn from the life, and then we convert that into technology. So they always go side by side. So you have in Delhi, you have this pillar, which is not rusted for 1500 years or so.
Minar.
Yeah, Qutub Minar. And so, but why doesn't it? Where is the chemistry? Oh, actually, there was a professor in IIT Kanpur who has written a book on it, and it's the same idea, herbal chemistry. They used herbs to create some certain type level of chemistry that even modern chemistry cannot do. With all the great technologies and instruments, we are not able to get the same level of chemistry as the biologically inspired, which is herbal, that was done at least a couple thousand years ago.
Thank you so much, Professor Balram Singh, for helping us learn, understand, and maybe open some windows and grow. But thank you so much.
It has been great pleasure talking to you. And like I said, I was taking, I think before off camera, that you do have knowledge. It's not just you have interest, but I'm glad that you have interest.
Well, thank you. But it's, I think it's only when we are empty that we learn.
It's true.
And so maybe always remain empty and learn constantly.
I cannot disagree with you on that one.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank
it has
you.
been great pleasure.